When we've considered the subject of authoritarianism on this podcast, often it's personified in some figurehead. When I spoke to the Turkish writer and political commentator Ece Temelkuran back in 2024, we wrangled over how Turkey's President Erdogan, who for Ece is leading Turkey down the path to a fascist future, could still retain vast popular support. For their supporters, authoritarians like Erdogan and many others are firm but fair straight talkers, able to speak to and behalf of the common people and rise to the current political moment. But to their critics, they can be terrifying dictators with the ability and desire to ruthlessly crush dissent and use violence against their own people to achieve their goals. While the trappings of autocracy are typically personified in a central figure of authority, they can be echoed right down to the individual level, the family level. Indeed, I'd go so far as to say that this is necessary for authoritarians to consolidate their power over an entire state, and for that power to extend not only across geographical space, but even across generations. That's something my guest this week has witnessed firsthand. Loubna Mrie began her life subordinating her fear of her violent father in favor of admiration and even love. It's a similar sentiment to the one she once held for President Faisal Al Assad of her home country in Syria, as a member of the Alawite community from which the Assad dynasty originally hailed. Loubna has just brought out a new memoir, Defiance, in which she narrates her reckoning with that relationship with her father, alongside her decision to join the uprising against Hafiz's son, Bashar. Listeners may be familiar with Loubna's story from when it made international headlines in 2012, after which she was forced to leave Syria. Her departure would ultimately have far-reaching and unforeseen consequences for her and for the mother that she loved. It's rare, I think, to hear the perspective of someone who has seen both sides of an authoritarian's perceived image. Loubna describes in great detail how the Assad's regime coloured her childhood and her family relationships, and how difficult it was for her to build up the courage to challenge those various figures of authority. But challenge them she did, joining the rebellion against the Assads, where her Alawite identity would almost get her killed. What Loubna is not doing with her book is offering the definitive account of the Syrian uprising. Instead, she's telling an intensely personal story, covering her journey from a village on Syria's coast to the heart of the revolution, to exile in Turkey, and then New York. It's colourful, insightful, and at times, searingly difficult to read. And fair warning, this is a difficult interview with moments that some listeners may find upsetting. We've discussed the downfall of the Assad regime on the podcast, and despite Loubna's close affiliation to and sincere belief in the uprising against Bashar, this interview, although she has an admirable capacity to find the humour in some tragic situations, was no celebration. The cost for Loubna has simply been too high for that. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Loubna Mrie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start with a meta question, really, because it struck me that you spend so much of your time in the memoir running from things. You write that it took you just an hour to pack up your life in Istanbul, and you wrote, "I am running away from the broken, chaotic version of myself this city has witnessed and constantly reminds me of." Now, that was 10 years ago, and I wondered that the Loubna who lived through that was just 22 at the time. And I wonder how it felt writing this memoir and spending time with that Loubna from your perspective.
Oh my God. At that point in my life, running away from everything, from grief, from memories, from spaces, was how I stayed sane and how I pushed myself forward. However, like later on, especially in around 2017, 2018, when I started to realize that there was this collective agreement to frame the Arab Spring as something that failed. And I mean, aside from the Arab Spring, also there was this moment in history where Assad was being normalized and Assad was being rehabilitated. So although my silence was protecting me, at that moment, it felt that I was being complicit in that erasure by being silent. So I had to make a decision. Do I stay silent to protect myself? But that silence also is helping Assad to get away with everything he's done to us. But also silence mean that not only you are protecting yourself, but also you are losing the people all over again,
Right.
because erasing someone's memory.
Yeah, so you're talking about a period, the late part of like the 2018 period, once it really
Yes.
became normalized,
Yes.
and it looked like, look, Assad is back, he's won this war.
Yeah.
And at that point, of course, you were living abroad, you were living in New York.
I was living in New York, but also I just want to say that I could not walk back memory lane until I felt that I had a future. And I sat down to work on the memoir during the last semester of school. And so I felt like, okay, now I can relax. Now I am not in a survival mode anymore. I need to sit down and write this for all the people that are in the book, but also for myself. I needed to make sense of what happened to me and to make sense of my story. And yeah, I mean, it was not an easy process at all. And I think the most difficult aspect of writing a memoir, I think, I don't know, your listeners who read memoirs can, I don't know, maybe relate. But the most difficult aspect of writing a memoir, especially a memoir that is loaded with pain and grief, is to be fair to people and be nuanced and write with love about even those you hate the most, because angers and pain tempts you to see things in absolutes and to flatten people into heroes and villains. And I knew I had a responsibility not to leave any parts of the story out. But when you flatten people, you are avoiding parts of the story. And this is something I didn't want to do. And that was very difficult to me, to being fair to the people, even those ones who caused me the most pain in my life.
You're talking, it sounds like you're talking about your father, who of course comes across as quite a difficult character, more than difficult, but we'll get to it. And you are, I don't know if perhaps you're necessarily fair to him, but you are, at the beginning of the book, you don't seem like you are painting him as a complete villain. As it goes on, it becomes obvious and you tell the stories that make him worse. But it did seem like you were trying to tell as much of the truth from your perspective as a child that the reader needed to understand.
Because, like in the early chapters, yes, like when I'm talking about like the most difficult aspects of writing the memoir, I'm actually referring to the early chapters, because in the early chapters I'm telling you about my perspective as a child. And as a child, we admire our parents. We love our parents. These are our first role models. And so, yes, later on, I despise my father as a daughter. However, I had a responsibility as an author to be truthful to the reader, to tell them that, yes, I did admire him growing up. Yes, I did admire the fact that when I knew that the scars on his leg were from assassination attempt, it made me admire him. I even adapted his abusive language towards my mother. And when my sister read the early chapters of the book, she told me that I sounded so soft on him, and I felt, and it seemed like I admired him.
Yeah.
But that was the truth. Yeah, of course I admired him growing up. We all do, admiring our parents growing up.
Yeah. Well, especially I think when you have an experience as you did early on, where you are away from your father for a long period of time when you are young. And you're very open about that. I mean, you've just mentioned that part about how you admire the scar on his leg, but also you say in the book that you admired the fact that he had a gun, he knew how to use it, people were afraid of him. And you liked that part.
Yeah, because I saw how people treated me differently when I told them my full name. And of course, as a child, it meant that I will be put in the front of the front of the class. That was beneficial to me as a child. And of course, as a child, you see how this is bringing you benefits into your life without questioning, okay, why people are afraid of him, why he has scars on his leg, why he has guns. And through the book, as I try to ask these questions, you see that I was not allowed to ask and get answers. And this is why throughout the book, what my father did and what my father's relationship to the government kind of stays vague, because it was vague.
It was vague to you.
To me,
Yeah, yeah.
yes. And I only knew the full picture of what the extent of my father's involvement with the government.
But yeah, you only find out certain things about your father later.
Yes.
But in particular, I think, to go back to the childhood part, I mean, he does come across as a violent, controlling figure. And partly, I think that the title, Defiance, of the book is as much against him as it is against the opposition to the Assad regime. I mean, you don't say that explicitly, but I think there is a kind of allegory in the book for how the authoritarianism that gripped Syria also manifested in individuals.
Yes, and that was something I truly wanted to make clear throughout the book, how like authoritarianism seeps into the family system, and how authoritarianism doesn't always have to wear a uniform and sit atop of a government. It sometimes can take the shape of inherited fears and societal expectations. And so when I went to that first protest, and then I realized like how brutal the government was, and the fact that the government was using fear in order to oppress people and oppressing people in the name of safety, it helped me see the parallels between patriarchy and authoritarianism, because at that point in my life, I did not have the vocabulary to make sense of all of that. But I knew that my father was controlling my life the same way the Syrian government was controlling its people. Like for my father, any question or any attempt to stand against him was an attempt for me to bring chaos into my life and shame to the family's name.
And that's the exact language that was used. You grew up in the Hafiz era, the father of Bashar al-Assad. And that was very much the language of it, that Hafiz is the father, he is the protector. And of course, you will remember, the audience will remember as well, that was also the language that when the uprising began against Assad, they used the language of chaos. That if it is not Bashar, if there is no government with Assad, then there will just be this chaos coming.
Yeah, so it's this one man who can protect everyone, and if you don't listen to this man, your life going to be plunged into chaos. And so the only way to keep the nation intact and the nation safe is by oppressing the nation. And that's exactly how the father figure operates. And this is, how sometimes like religion operates, like you are being oppressed in the name of safety and in the name of we know what's better for you. Just to actually emphasize how Hafiz was the father figure, actually, when I was first and second grade, I used to call him Baba Assad, and that was very normalized.
Yeah. That was quite common, actually. In schools, they would encourage it.
Yeah, and he was he was Baba Assad. He was not President Assad. He was Father Assad. This is why when he died later in 2000, I was 10 years old. His death really, really, really shook me, because until that moment in my life, I was always told he doesn't die. He's immortal. He's gonna stay there forever. He's, he's our father, he's our protector. And I admit in the book that I truly loved him. Like, for me, he was not just the president. He was the person that allowed Alawite kids to go to school. And that was emphasized throughout school years. Whenever we show up to Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, which was the name of my ibtidai, what's ibtidai in English?
Primary school.
Primary school. Okay, how did I write a book if I don't know the name of ibtidai? Sorry, but throughout my ibtidai, if we show up to school, if we show up to class and we have not memorized our lessons, the teacher would remind us, listen, you don't have any reason not to memorize your lessons, because when Baba Assad was your age, he was walking in the mud for miles, and he would show up to school with mud all over, his legs, sometimes reaching his hips. So his childhood stories were really repeated to us a lot as in a disciplinary way, to be reminded that if you don't study, if you don't push harder, then you are ungrateful for all the sacrifices and all all the things he did for us to be able to go to school.
Well, that was, I think some of the audience perhaps it won't quite follow this aspect of the story, which is the Alawite background that you came from and that the Assad family came from. So perhaps you can just give us just a brief overview so that people can situate you from the Alawite community and what it broadly meant within Syria.
Okay, so I am from I am Alawite, and Alawites is a small minority in Syria that was historically oppressed. During the French Mandate, one of the French tactics were to recruit minorities into the army. And this is how some Alawite figures got into the army and they rose up the ranks. One of them was Faisal Al Assad, and he took over the presidency in there was a series of coups.
He took over Syria. Through that process, he also empowered this very marginalized, historically poor community.
This is, yes, this is why when Hafiz al-Assad took power, it didn't matter for the Alawites that he exiled some of his comrades, jailed some of his comrades. It didn't matter because at that moment in history, it felt like the end of marginalization for a whole community.
Right. And so that made it, because of that, it made it doubly upsetting and a betrayal for the community when you then turned against the Assad regime.
Yes, because when the uprising started, Alawites did not, I mean, not all Alawites, but I would say the majority of the community, they did not see it as an uprising for freedom and equal rights and uprising for all Syrians. No, they saw it as an attempt to send the Alawites back to the mountains and send the Alawites back to the marginalization that they escaped by having Assad in power. And I just want to say, it's also very important to tell the listeners that even when Hafiz and Bashar was in power, the historical events and historical tragedies that our community suffered were always reminded and were always told to us, like, and this is why I now see a lots of parallels with current events, how oppressors always use historical tragedies and historical events to justify collective punishments and to justify current oppression, because because you start to choose between freedom, that is an aspect, and the fear that and the trauma and historical tragedies that you were been told all your life about.
And these things are real. I mean, I think one of the parts that perhaps outsiders to Syria couldn't really understand during the uprising was why certain communities stuck with the Assad regime, like the Christian community. And the reason, of course, is not really that they enjoyed the authoritarianism of the regime. It is that, like the Alawites, they were a minority among Muslims, and they felt that some of the historical stories might become real, that if Assad wasn't there to protect these minorities, there could genuinely be some of the killings that you saw right next door in Iraq. I'm not justifying that belief. I am saying, though, that it didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't that they subscribed to some of the stories that the Assad regime had told them purely because they were credulous. It was also because they had their own historical knowledge of what had happened to their communities.
Yeah, and I also, like, not to paint the uprising and the perfect brush here, but also there was a lot of sectarianism in the beginning of the uprising. There was a lot of sectarianism after, and I would say that sectarianism in Syria is real. And even though in the beginning of the uprising we didn't want to see it, we didn't want to name it, but it's impossible not to have sectarian tension when you have a government that is hiding behind a minority. So now, 10 years after the uprising and a year after Assad's overthrow, I would say that the main root cause of the sectarianism we are seeing today and we saw before was Assad, and the fact that he hid behind this sect, and he in so many ways made it seem like the government was Alawite.
Even though a lot of the people in the upper echelons, I mean, the upper echelons of the army were Alawites.
Were Sunnis. but like also there was Sunni.
The political leadership,
Yes.
a lot of them were Sunnis, yeah, absolutely, and Christians as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
But I mean, we're moving the story on, and some people may not quite follow where we are. So what happens is the uprising begins, and you start to get involved. You start to pay attention to this in a way that perhaps historically you hadn't. And you're still a very young person, and then you start to see things within the uprising, just as you were saying, that make you think that, well, perhaps it's not this utopian idea that that some of the people involved are suggesting. There's this quite a shocking scene later in the book where you talk to a rebel about your Alawite identity, and he's trying to help you being smuggled across the border, and he almost, well, you tell the story. I mean, it almost cost you his life.
So I was trying to cross from Syria to Turkey, and back then, summer of 2012, if you're active in the uprising, you will seek routes through the rebel-held areas. And back then, some of the villages on the Turkish borders were controlled by the Free Syrian. I mean, it was not Free Syrian Army back then. It was just like a bunch of rebels.
Yeah.
So I was put in touch with this, I wouldn't say commander, I would say just like this individual. His name is Abu Ammar Andron, to give his full name, Abu Ammar Andron. And I was... He's dead. It's okay. So I was put in touch with this Abu Ammar Andron, and he was very nice to me. Like, he was very helpful.
Why are you trying to save him, Faisal? He tried to kill you.
Yeah, Faisal, come on. This guy tried to kill me.
I'm so
anyway,
sorry. I'm so sorry. It's the journalist in me. I'm like, should we get his side of the story? Oh, he's dead.
Don't worry, Abu Ammar is not going to take you to court.
Okay.
So, it was, and it was such a, like, at that moment, you just, if someone puts a good word for you with another person, you're safe. So this person gets in touch with Abu Ammar. He tells him, hey, we have a friend trying to cross to Turkey. Can you help her? I talk with Abu Ammar over the phone, very brief conversation. All he knows that I'm coming from Damascus. So I show up to the mountain with my camera. He helps me by finding me a family to host me, because as a female, I cannot stay with them. I was put with a family. And so when I told him I want to take some photos and videos in the mountain, he offered to help. And I'm not covered. I'm not trying to hide my identity or anything. And at some point, we are filming in a mosque after it got bombed by the Syrian forces. And while I'm interviewing the mosque caretaker, he says something about like how Alawites pigs in the village next by bombed the mosque. And then me being me, I was like, oh my God, how dare you? No, Alawites, not all Alawites are with the government. I am Alawite. And
he had said, I don't know if this was clear, but he had said, apologies for using the word again, but he had said Alawite pigs.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I wrote that in the book.
I think you did, yeah.
I mean, but he said, like, he used very sectarian language.
You don't want to be gratuitous about the language, but it gives you a sense of what people, even people who were fighting against an authoritarian system, felt about this minority that they felt was the
exactly.
group leaders. Yeah.
And at that moment, it was my first time, and not my last, where I see something and I'm capturing something with my camera, and I know it will make the uprising look bad. So I stop the camera, I fix the narrative, and then I film again. So when I'm filming him and he's saying Alawite pigs, I turn off the camera and I have a conversation with him. The core of that conversation that, hey, I am Alawite. Not all Alawites are with are supportive of the government. There are so many. And back then, at that moment, I also, at that time, I was friends with so many activists who are from minority backgrounds, especially in Damascus. So I told the guy all of this, and Abu Ammar was standing there, and he was like, oh, I didn't know that you were Alawite. The guy who asked me to help you told me that you're from Damascus. And I said, oh, no, I live in Damascus now, but I'm actually from Jable. And I turned my camera again, and I repeat the interview with the mosque caretaker, and he gives me this whole he gives me this whole speech about, like, we don't have a problem with Alawites, we don't have problems with minorities, we're all brothers and sisters. anyways, I left that interview feeling super content. But later on, Abu Ammar shows up to the house of the family where I was staying. He demands my camera. He takes it. He looks through my photos. I think he disappeared for like half an hour. In the meantime, another activist in the mountain came and he told me that I should leave with him right away. He's actually now a famous, he was back then a famous activist, still a famous activist. He came, he's like, I remember you messaged me on Facebook asking me about like routes to go to Turkey. And I heard earlier in the mountain that they had captured an Alawite spy.
He actually
with
came
a camera.
looking for you. That's the story you tell in the book.
Yes.
That he knew you, but he didn't know you that well. But when he heard of this person who was an Alawite spy who'd lived in Damascus, he realized, oh, that's Loubna, and they're probably going to kill her.
She came with a camera and she had curly hair. And so Omar was like, oh my God. And he told me and then I remembered that you've been messaging me that you want to flee to Turkey, but he did not respond to me at that. When I was messaging him about the route, he stood up and he asked these commanders, well, how do we know that she's actually a spy? And no one was able to answer Omar. And so he brought another commander, Hussein Tarbouch. I don't know if we're gonna name names here.
You're naming everybody. I don't know what's going on.
I'm great. I'm grateful for Omar. I'm grateful for Hussein Tarbouch. I don't know if he's Hussein Tarbouch where he is at this point, but I remember Omar told me. I don't know if I mentioned all of that in the book, but I remember Omar told me that Hussein Tarbouch was like, listen, if you trust this girl, I'm just gonna bring my gun and let's go. Let's go just see what's going on. And later on, Omar told me that, Abu Ammar had planned to kill me. He was so proud that he had captured a spy. And at that moment, it felt so surreal that I felt, in a way, I was so deep in my denial to see that, the uprising could not be that perfect.
Yeah.
I just did not want to believe. I did not want to believe Omar. I felt like, okay, something else is going on. Probably he misunderstood.
I think it gives you an insight. In the end, you do go with him and you make it across the border. But I think it gives you an insight into how quickly this rainbow idea of the revolution could be upended. You saw it yourself later because you crossed back from Turkey into Manbij. And at that point, you were seeing the beginnings of what became ISIS. Tell us a bit about that, about the first time you really realized, because you have this romantic idea of what the uprising is in Damascus, and then you leave the country, and of course when you are on the border in Turkey, you are surrounded by activists, surrounded by people organizing, surrounded by people who really believe in this uprising. And then when you go back into Manbij, you suddenly realize that some of the people who are coming to fight for us maybe believe very different things to what we thought.
Yeah, even when I would cross to Syria, I was also surrounded by people who shared the same vision of what Syria should look like as me. So we were not just outside of Syria, there was lots of people like myself in Manbij. For example, Sheikh Munzir, who is a big part of the Manbij chapters, he was the person who opened his house for us. He's the person who hosted us. He did not have an issue with me being an Alawite. He always had my back. And even when, at that point, when I had this argument, I think you're referring to the argument I had with the Egyptian guy.
Fighter, yeah.
So until that moment, we knew foreign fighters existed. Again, in my 22 years old brain, I thought okay, this is not a big deal. We just learned how to justify their existence by, for example, saying things like, they're here to die. Okay, let them die. When this war gonna end, they're just gonna leave.
But you said that. Other people weren't saying it. You said that. You quote yourself in the book saying that.
Yes. It was a line that I quoted from other people that I started to repeat it myself. Because at that moment, politically, I did not know how to process things on my own. So I would ask people around me, how do we think about these stuff? And I would pick and choose what aligned with me, and I would adapt it. However, there were people who were so terrified of them and they saw the danger before we were able to see that, no, these people are not just going to leave Syria. For example, Naji al-Jirif, who is also a big part of the book, he was my first mentor, and we met in Damascus. Later on, he crosses to Turkey. We worked together, and he was one of the main people in my life who kept telling us like, no, these people, if they get strong, they are going to hijack everything and we should not normalize their existence. And he was right. And eventually Naji gets killed by ISIS in Turkey. So
I thought this was part of the book that I thought was really interesting, because you do take us inside the revolution, the early days, and you don't try to sugarcoat it. You don't try to pretend that it was perfect and there were all these ideologues. You demonstrate that a lot of the people were just naive. They didn't know what they were doing. And they also didn't realize, as we will come to later, the extent to which there were other factors at play, that there were other ideologies elsewhere in the region that were, let's say, more thought through than the revolutionaries, more organized. And then once those people arrived, the strength of their ideology overtook the sort of weak ties that the revolutionaries had. And we ended up where we ended up.
Absolutely. And one of the core reasons why Islamists and foreign fighters were able to take over and kind of put themselves in the forefront was because the brutality of the Assad government back then was so horrendous that you needed people who were equally brutal to stand up for that government. So when I had the fight with that Egyptian guy, I knew I am not capable of offering to this war the same things that he's offering. I'm only able to offer my camera. I'm like organizing with people. I'm like showing up to meetings and doing like media workshops for people. But this guy is willing to bomb, to kill, like to die. This person is willing to bomb himself on a checkpoint, and I'm not capable of doing that. This is after all the barrel bombs. This is after the Scud missiles that would destroy like 5 buildings in one hit. It was the reason why people welcomed those foreign fighters. You needed equally brutal people to show up and stand against this government.
Because you were facing people who were used to using weapons, used to using barrel bombs, used to using missiles. And what can you do to stand against it? There's a limit to what speeches and pictures can do.
Yeah, and you know, another reason why the Islamists were able to take over was that the moderate opposition, the moderate rebels, were not that organized. They did not know how to handle all of this. They were more concerned about providing and finding foreign donors and foreign backing instead of taking out the weeds from their army. Like there was lots of tashwil, as we call it. There was lots of looting. There was lots of thugs. And, you know, people did not know how to deal with them. One of the thugs I write about is Hassan Seks. And, you know, he's very famous in Minbij. And we still don't know why he was called Hassan Seks. Some people said he would try to like stand against closing brothels. Some people said he was selling porn in school. So, but Hassan Seks was a leader. Hassan Seks,
for the audience, that surname Seks is not a real surname, just in case people are wondering.
No, this is his nickname. But also they
thought, really? So you thought that there was a guy called Hassan Seks and he had nothing to do with pornography? Well, obviously, he's going to be...
I mean, that was his nickname. But like there was like Al Jazara, Carrot, and there was like the Prince. So there was like lots of these thugs that were around, and they were like, I don't know, like you should just put them in their place, hold them accountable. But I think
they didn't.
People didn't have the tools. People didn't have the vocabulary. It was a very chaotic, brutal conflict that people were learning as they go. And I think this is why I made the decision in the book. So in the childhood section, you have the book written in past tense. But later on, after the Arab Spring, I switched to present tense because I truly wanted to take the reader with me as I go, because I was learning as I'm going through this conflict, and I was not alone in this. And the mistakes that were made in the uprising were not done because these were bad people. It was because people found themselves facing one of the most brutal governments in the last decade. I mean, not last, like in like recent history. So you just don't have the tools.
So
and of course you're going to learn as you go. Yeah.
You've written elsewhere that you don't like the fact that people only know you for two things. They know that you're Alawite and they know a second part of your story. And I felt that we should give the podcast time to breathe before we come to what is quite a heavy subject, which is the second part of your identity. Most people will know you as the Alawite girl who defected. And then what happened?
And then, so after the thing with Abu Ammar, I was so full of anger about what happened, and not just with him. I was very angry with the fact that I could not stand up for him. Like when he took my camera, I was angry with myself that I resorted to the same tactics I often used with my dad, is just by being silent, making myself small, and just not push back. And when Abu Ammar took my camera, I resorted back to the same like survival techniques that I have learned growing up. And when I was saved by Omar, I was so angry with myself that I did not stand up for myself. So later on, before I crossed to Turkey, I decided to film a small video in the mountains saying that I'm an Alawite, that we exist, that it was something that the government should know, that not all the opposition are Salafists, are Sunnis, but also it was my way to tell the opposition that I exist, even though if you try to tell me that I don't matter and people like me don't exist and we are all spies that deserve to be killed, like, no, I want to give you the finger in your mountain and say that, no, I do exist despite what you think of me. Unfortunately, I was also, I would say I was like young and naive enough not to understand the consequences that would come with that video. Unfortunately, it was uploaded and my mother was taken after that video. I tried to get, sorry, I'm like jumping a lot in time. It's very sensitive subject. I wish I can just not talk about it, but I have to. So the video is uploaded. I
mean, I can say some of the words for you if that helps.
Yeah, or if you want to read some parts of what happened would be good.
Well, the story, I mean, you write about it and it's a big part of the book. I realize that because now you've written the book and you've only just started doing publicity for it. So you're only just getting into retelling the story, perhaps for the first time. I imagine it's quite hard to...
You know, what's so sad is like, I can't, like, even writing about it. I mean, it was so difficult writing about all of this. And most of the book was written during COVID. So I was not only trapped in the house, not only the world was like, that not only the world stopped, but also I was so stuck in my past that it was one of the most difficult things I had to do. And now realizing that this is not just me and the keyboard anymore. Like now I have to verbalize all of this, and it's so painful. Like it's so painful because I truly survived her absence. I truly survived my mother's absence by pushing her memory away and pushing everything related to her away. And now it feels like I have to relive her absence and disappearance over and over again in order to get the people to know what this book is about.
Well, that's why, I mean, I'm treading slightly gently with you, because I recognize that, of course, you've written this book, but at the same time, these are the early days of you verbalizing it, the early days of you coming on interviews with people like me and saying these very painful things and retelling these stories. So you cross over the rest of the stories that you cross over, and then you find out that your mother seems to have disappeared. And for a long period of time, you can't work out why that is. You are there with your sister. Neither of you know where your mother is. At a certain point, you decide that she has been killed. And then you get confirmation by a friend of your father's that she has actually been killed. Being killed by your father. There is a lot of foreshadowing in the book about what might happen to your mother. There's the last phone call you make with her just before you cross. I just want to read a little bit of it. And I apologize. I realize that this is very painful. I can see you on the camera. I realize it's very painful. We can stop, but I understand also that you want to tell the story,
it's okay.
but it's just it's hard to tell
you go ahead.
So this is from the phone call as you cross the border. And you're talking to her. We're coming back, I shout when you're talking about yourself and your sister. We're coming back, I shout when I hear her low weeping, irritated that the call fails to comfort me as I'd hoped it would, only compounding my worry. Instead, I tell her I have to go. I might have even yelled that I did not need more stress before I hung up, not knowing that for years I would replay the phone call in my head and wonder what would have happened if I'd turned back. Do you now wonder what might have happened if you'd turned back?
No, but I like I truly wish I was a better daughter in those last phone calls we had. And I think that's what we do when, as I don't know, not children, like daughters and sons, we just assume our parents are gonna live forever and they're gonna stay there forever, and we just take them for granted. And in those last days when I was like crossing to Turkey and I was so stressed and I didn't tell her about what happened with Abu Ammar, I just took her for granted and I just didn't. And I wish I was able to just maybe just like take a moment to tell her that how much I just like loved her and how much she shaped my life and how much I like grateful for her for making me the person I am today.
A lot of the book does seem like it's like a love story or a paean to kind of the love that you had for her and the things that she tried to do to teach you and give you an education. It is also, of course, a recognition of what happened on an individual level to a lot of people, the brutality of this regime in defending itself. A big part of the book is, I think, to do with your guilt and how you feel guilty about what? Well, I should let you tell it. I mean, you say in the book, let me read a little part about it, where you say, part of me will always believe that I am indeed guilty. I'm guilty of underestimating my mother's fear of my father, of assuming that she was overreacting, of not realizing that taking a stand against the system that had lifted my family out of extreme poverty, making them one of the wealthiest Alawite families in Syria, would be considered a mortal sin. Should we take a...
Yeah, I think...
Do you want to take a moment?
No. I think part of my guilt was that I truly really underestimated everything. And I not only I underestimated my father's brutality, but throughout this book, even when I went to the protest, I was so brainwashed and I was so sheltered from the realities that were happening in the country and the realities even about my father, that I did not understand the consequences of my actions. I mean, even when I go to the protest, for example, I am not aware that that I could be killed. Like when I go to the protest, I'm like thinking in the back of my head, I'm like, oh, are we gonna like eat lunch after, or we're gonna smoke hookah? Like that was what was in my head at the moment. And with my mother's, I she always warned me about what my father was capable of, but she never told me any details, and I did not understand that my father was a killer. I only knew about this later in life, and I did not know that my father made his wealth from assassinating people. I did not know that my father was actually capable of using these guns that I've seen around growing up. So my guilt was that I did not calculate the risks, and I did not understand that my actions had a lot of consequences, not only because I was standing against the government, but also because my family was part of the system.
It was part of the system, yeah. I mean, there is certainly an overlap between the way that people think about like the individuals, but also misunderstanding the depths to which the regime would go to save itself. And I think, I mean, you said earlier, it's one of the most brutal regimes of the past decade. And I think very few people who had seen what they thought of a stability of the Assad regimes believed that they would go so far to the point of exiling 50% of their own people, slaughtering people, mass graves, all of these stories that we now hear about, that they would go that far in order to save themselves. And there is an overlap with your father's experience with your mother, where you interpret later in the book that the reason that you feel he did what he did was a way to protect himself and like the Alawite name from being killed by the regime for you defecting.
Yeah, I feel he wanted to prove to everyone that my actions were not his action and that he disapproved of my actions. So I think it was a way for him to protect himself and to protect the family and to protect his privileges and to protect his connections, which is why later when I was told that my father was in jail, it truly made me feel like, okay, this is some kind of a justice for me, because this is the system that you gave everything for. This is the system that you killed for and went to the extremes to prove your loyalty for. Eventually threw you in jail.
You feel that you come later in the book. I mean, at the time when it happens, you feel very guilty about what happened to your mother. But later, you come to a more understanding place about what happened. And I think you start to feel that it wasn't directly connected. You realize that this really didn't have anything to do with you directly. It was to do with your father.
Yes, and I feel by, again, like writing this book and trying to understand my father and the system that produced him and the patterns that made this person capable of this type of violence was not like related to me, as you said. Like it was related to him, and it was like his brutality was not a consequence to my actions. It was who he was.
It was who he was, yeah. I think we should move on from it. I want to say one more thing, though, about the grief. You write at one point that I wonder if I never allowed myself to grieve because somehow if I didn't allow myself to mourn your mother, I could deny her death. She is the compass I press to my heart, the one I look to whenever I doubt myself or my path. And I think you did spend a lot of your book trying to run away from mourning your mother and recognizing the reality of what had happened. But I also felt that you didn't allow yourself to mourn yourself. Because that was something that struck me, even when we got to the end of the book, that you talk at one point about how your life was split in two before and after she died. And it felt to me like you didn't ever mourn for that lost part, that version of you that existed before. You never allowed yourself to have the space to say, I'm sorry that went away.
It's very hard to give yourself grace and to allow yourself to mourn if you are full of guilt. And that was that's what was standing between me and me allowing myself to grieve and mourn for myself. And this is what I'm doing now. I feel like for so many years I was so full of anger and blame, and I thought everything that happened was because of me. But after making sense of my losses by writing this book, I allowed myself to see that I was not guilty. I was one of the victims. And I And I'm very grateful I reached this point now. I mean, yeah, it took me, 14 years at this point, but I'm grateful that I was able to do that. And I'm able to like really look back on that 22 years old Loubna and just feel bad for her, not angry with her. And that really changed with writing the book, but also to admit that I was just running away from my grief. And one of the tools that helped me doing that was alcohol, which I write about in the book. And it was last year when I decided I am done escaping my grief. I am done numbing myself. It's time to let go of that old friend that helped me throughout the years, and I'm gonna say goodbye, and I'm just gonna move forward. And
you went into rehab, you say in the book.
Yeah, I went to rehab. I have been dating a person who has been wonderful, and one of the main issues between us was alcohol. He told me I have a alcohol issue, which I knew, but I always underestimated it and I downplayed it. And he told me, okay, let's send you to rehab. And I finally felt I was ready. I was ready to let go of whatever crutch I have been using over these years. And I went to rehab November of 2024.
Well, it was in rehab that you heard that the Assad regime had fallen.
I was going to finish the story.
Well, I wanted to come to it, but before I come to it, I actually wanted to hear just a little bit more about your life in exile, because again, I'm trying to offer you some grace. I'm not justifying what you say was your abuse of alcohol. But you had been through so much, leaving your country, the situation with your mother, going into exile in the US, all of these different things. I mean, those are incredibly difficult things to do at any age, and then to do them in such a short time, and to do them alone. I mean, when you talk about being in Turkey, and when you are in Turkey, there's a large community of Syrians. You can go and speak Arabic. You can be around people who understand you. And then you talk about what it was like when you got to New York, where some people didn't even know where Syria was.
Not only that, for a long period of time, I had to fake names and numbers for my emergency contact on forms and applications. I was that lonely. I had, people, friends, neighbors, whatever, but I did not feel that any of them will show up to me if anything bad happened. And, and so many applications here, you need to put the emergency contact. So I found myself just like lying and making up names and numbers. But also, not only it was an exile, it was also the cultural shock of how individualistic the US is. That even siblings sometimes can live in the same city and they don't hang out. Some people here only see their parents for like Thanksgiving and Christmas. This is not how we were raised. This is not how we were brought up. Like in Turkey, there is no evening I spent alone. Like even in Aleppo, when I was in Eastern Aleppo, I write about like how every single evening we would hang out.
I mean, that gives you, I think there's a part in the book where you're with a Syrian guy in Turkey and you're socializing and you're talking about people going to mental health therapy. And he says, we don't need mental health therapy. We have this. And to a certain degree, I mean, those connections, those human connections, they allow you to get through the trauma.
It allows you to go through the trauma, but also it allows you to escape it
and not face it and not
face it. And I think that was maybe, now looking back, yes, hanging out in Aleppo every single night or hanging out in Gaziantep every single night, even if we're not talking, even if we're just like scrolling on our phones, all being in the same room, it wasn't socializing. It was us being so terrified of being left alone with our thoughts. This is why I think so many Syrians dealt with so much depression after they left to Europe, because Europe does not allow you to escape this way. You have to face your past. You cannot outrun your losses. Like you just can't do that. It will come back and and fuck you
Well,
up.
this is why, I wanted to offer you a little bit of grace for the alcohol abuse, because I think sometimes when we think about what happened during these revolutionary periods, you don't realize how much people suffered on an individual scale. Individually, how much they dealt with. I liked a line that you wrote because it struck me as being such an important part of the revolution story and the other revolutions, not just the Syrian revolution, but one that is often missed in the headlines. And that is that the revolution is about people as individuals and the toll that it takes on their life. You write that it would take me years to understand that under pressure, under the fear of death by execution, by torture, by bombing, people can release the monster they've spent most of their lives repressing. I didn't know then that almost every marriage, every friendship that I saw blooming around us in Damascus during this time would die. So many love stories, all of them decimated, just like our hopes of what Syria would become.
And it's important to note to the listeners that this part comes after the part where I have a argument with one of my best friends in Damascus, and he hits me. And I again, as I was saying before, that when you're writing, you really need to be writing about even people's dark sides with grace. And I wrote that just to show the reader that, yes, although this individual hit me, he's not a monster. He was just under so much, not to excuse his actions at all, but just to say that people turn into monsters under these circumstances, and it's very difficult to keep a moral compass while the world is burning around you.
When you feel that you might be next in the firing line, when someone might come in the middle of the night and take you or take your family, you react differently. The human brain is not built to withstand that level of pressure. And so I'm not making excuses for the story of the man, but I am perhaps making some excuse for you and the way that you say in the book you don't feel that you coped with the last few years well. And perhaps I'm saying that I think it's a long process of dealing with this. And in a broader sense, not just as you as an individual, I look around at the people that I've met in these revolutions, and I think how hard it is for them, how impossible it is for them to go and can continue living their lives, usually often in countries where the people have no knowledge of what happened, no knowledge of what it takes. And as you say about your time in New York, they don't even have the vocabulary of relationships. They say, well, you haven't seen your cousin or your brother or something like this in 5-6 years. Oh, well. And they don't quite know what that means when you come from a different culture.
Yeah, and add to it, not only you are in exile, but you are watching your oppressors getting away with everything they have done to you. And this is and this is why I truly feel for people my age that took part in the Arab Spring, because we were part of this movement where we felt we were bigger than life itself, and we risked everything for the belief that if we just document, if we just tell the world what is happening, things going to change, things going to be better. We are able to hold people accountable if we just speak about what happened. And fast forward, you're in exile, you're watching your oppressors on TV, and you're watching them, with their political handshakes and nods, and the world seemed to have moved on from and normalized your suffering. So yes, you will turn into coping mechanisms, and you will turn into destructive behaviors. And just to close the circle of the alcohol usage, I also admit that my alcohol usage was also a problem for me growing up. And it was not something frowned upon, especially in the Alawite society, because for us, we take pride in the fact that we are allowed to drink, not like our Sunni friends, but we are proud that we are able to drink. And, children, like some Alawite children's, you give them a sip of ara to show that, oh, look, he can tolerate ara as much as they can tolerate milk.
This is the Syrian Turkish drink, but the
Oh, no, it's not Syrian Turkish drink. Sorry, it's Syrian Alawite drink.
Of all, we've been talking for an hour about the Syrian revolution. I'm surprised that this is the thing This is the thing that finally...
Because I get annoyed when people, talk about alcohol, I'm like, oh yeah, like arak. And they're like, oh, you mean raki? I'm like, excuse me, no, it's arak. Anyways, but like arak but like, I mean, like even like it was, alcohol is so ingrained in the Alawite culture that even the type of alcohol later on becomes the symbol if you have made it in life or not. Like poor Alawites drink Ara, but the sophisticated, fancy Alawites drink Johnny Walker or like champagne. So it was also a sign of where you are in class. So yeah, never thought alcoholism was a term because it was always something very normalized.
Interesting how these things, they come back later. You start to realize that you see the connections with them after many years. I don't think you said that in the book, but it was at this period. Let's just finish the state of the story. That this particular period, this is around 2016. You say, and this was the part when Assad was being brought back into the fold of nations and pretty much the revolution was over, you started to feel that you needed to move on with your life. And you say that actually you started to pay less attention to what was happening in Syria. You kind of didn't quite close the book, but you were just not watching it all the time, on your phone all the time. And then you move away from that period for about 8 years. And then, as you were saying earlier with the story, you go into rehab, and it is in rehab that you find out that the Assad regime collapsed. Yeah. And you say something which I thought was really interesting in the book. You say that how was it so easy for Assad to run away? And if it was so easy for him to run away then, why didn't he do it earlier? And what would have remained of your own family and the whole of the country if he had just done it all those years earlier?
Yeah, and that's why I spent the night crying after I learned the news. And it was very isolating to be in rehab with a bunch of people who did not understand the weight of that moment. I actually, just to tell the listeners that, so yeah, I was in rehab at that moment. At that point, December 7th, we were coming back from a meeting actually outside of the facility. And every night before bed, they take your pulse and, vitals. And for a couple of weeks before then, I knew something was happening, but I refused to follow the news. I knew I was too weak to cling to any hope, because in the Syrian case, hope only caused you pain. I was sick of disappointments, and I was like, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm done with my Syria addiction. I need to focus on this current addiction right now. And you are not allowed to have your phone. So they were taking my vitals that night. And I just asked the guy to give me my phone, just like to check it before bed. And he gives me my phone, and I open it up. And from the stack of notifications, I knew Assad was gone. And I remember looking at him, and I'm like Assad is gone. And he's typing on his, PC, and he's like, okay. Like, I was so shocked by like how this phrase meant so much to me. So much deaths happened for this word to be uttered. And this guy who is completely in his world, in his rehab world, he's like, thinks it's just like a normal event. And I was so alone in all these feelings I was having. And I was just like crying that whole night. I was crying of anger, not the happiness. I was not celebrating. I was so angry that if this was so easy for him to just pack and go in his plane, why he did not do this earlier? Like, why did we have to go through all of this? And also I was angry for my community and so enraged for all the Alawite families that lost their kids fighting for this guy, fighting for this army, believing like he's gonna stay there until last day and fight for them. And he just left without even saying anything to them. Like, he still refuses to address this society that have lost 30,000 people like fighting for him. And this is why actually my hometown Jable is called the capital of martyrs. Like, there was thousands of young men who died, and this guy just like packs and leaves, and he does not even bother to like Just say a single word. Just say, I'm sorry. Just anything. Sorry, I'm so angry. I'm still angry now after a year and a half. Like, I'm so angry that it was also, I'm also so angry with like, that he was going to stay if in the last couple of years things changed on the geopolitics level. Like if geopolitics did not change, Assad would have still be the same, and he would probably pass presidency to his son. You know, like all of it felt so unfair for us, for all our losses and pain and everything, you know.
How do you feel now about what's happening in Syria, or perhaps what's happening in the wider Middle East? I noted that you had a more positive response to the Arab Spring in the book. You wrote, even though new dictators replaced the old ones, the Arab Spring succeeded in instilling in many of us a belief in the power of change and the conviction that we can never let our oppressors silence us in the name of order and protection. Should I take from that that you are optimistic about the future of Syria, the future of the region?
I'm optimistic about that. You know, if the Arab Spring taught us to dream, I think the period after the Arab Spring taught us to think. And the new generation that came after that period became aware of how, you know, of like what to do if a new uprising took place. And I am optimistic about the fact that people started to be to have political awareness. And I feel that was one of the products of the Arab Spring. But another product was like personal liberation. So many people started to understand that, no, you can choose what's good for you and you can choose your own path, you know. And I write in the book how like I know so many Syrians and Arabs who, you know, like changed their careers or like left their husbands, or they stood against their families. And it was, I mean, the political and the personal in the Middle East are so intertwined. And yes, although we can argue the Arab Spring failed politically, but on personal level it really shaped a new generation that understands that you are allowed to dream.
I want to end by asking you what you think about Syria today and whether you think that you will go back. You say at the very end in the epilogue that there is so little for you to go back to Syria for. Do you still feel that way? Or is it perhaps you need a few more years before you're able to go back?
You know, of course, I love Syria and I still carry it with me, but I no longer confuse that love with belonging. And with everything that happened in the last year, of course, I am happy that Assad is overthrown. However, I refuse to see that anyone less criminal than Assad is a success story for the country. I think Syrians deserve a government that treats them all equally and treats them based on, and just treats them with respect. And it just scares me that Assad will always be kind of like the bar, because that bar is so low. And it worries me that anything better than Assad is going to be, it's going to be seen as a success story, because we deserve better.
And you personally? Do you think you'll go back?
Me personally? You know, it scares me to go back. It scares me to go back and see like Syria without my mom. And it feels like to go back into the spaces that are so associated with people that no longer exist. It will make you feel that you lost them again. You lost them a second time. And I am just, I don't know. I struggle with that question a lot. You know, I feel like I have held on to memories about that place and about the people who no longer exist. And it worries me that if I go see these places without them, I will be stripped away from those memories that I hold on to, and memories that can help me like keep them alive in my psyche. I don't know if I make sense. Do I make sense? No, I don't make any sense. It scares me. It definitely scares me. It scares me to go back to Syria and realize how long I've been gone and how much time I spent away and how much I changed and the country changed. You know, Feroz says that line, أكبر بها الغربة ما تعرفني بلادي. That line really hits me. You know, it's like you change so much in your exile, and then when you finally go back home, you realize like, oh, I changed so much. Home is no longer a home. And that's why I feel like I'm still struggling with the idea of like home and where do I belong, and it's okay to understand that home is not where you are born, and it's okay to let go of the home if belonging to that home required you to be a lesser version of yourself or to amputate parts of your soul to fit in. And I feel Syria did that to me. And at this point, now looking back at all the pain and grief this country had caused me, it truly feels like an abusive relationship. You love it so much and it doesn't love you back. It only gives you pain.
Loubna Mrie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Defiance, a memoir of awakening, rebellion and survival in Syria by Loubna Mrie is out later this month and is available for pre-order now. This week's episode was produced by Finbar and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.